I just froze. I'm not sure what's going on there, but anyways, not much to do about it. But I don't need an orange example this time because actually the very nature of spillovers or externalities is what's driving the need to socially distance at present, and why probably we almost certainly have a suboptimal amount of social distancing. Basically, there are many cases in the world, or there may be cases in the world, where the person making a decision either bears only part of the benefit and all of the costs, or gets all of the benefit and only bears part of the cost. Basically, we could talk about negative spillovers and positive spillovers. In other words, when my behavior has an impact on you negatively, then we would call that a negative spillover. In other words, if my behavior has an impact on you that I am not forced to take into account, we would be here. In which case, what would we expect? We would expect too much of the behavior. In other words, what have we done? We have reduced the private cost below the social cost. In other words, I'm able to offload part of the cost onto you. On the other hand, in the cases where I bear all of the costs and get only part of the benefit, that would be the same thing as reducing the benefit while holding the cost constant. In that case, people would engage in too little of the behavior. So my decision to go out and about and run my life as usual, to not stay home, again, what happens? I get all of the benefit pretty much of doing that. But along the way, do I bear all of the cost? No. The whole point of disease transmission is that I actually end up imposing some cost on other people by being infectious, right? So in that case, we would expect too much of people going out and about and not socially distancing, which would be the argument for government intervention to say, look, we need to try and find a way to increase the cost of the behavior. Because if we can do that, then we're going to get the optimum. So one of the areas where externalities or spillovers are useful is, right, we've got maybe pollution, again, contagious disease. There's a whole bunch of areas here. Again, part of the reason, part of what we've been talking about, and this should have been somewhat clear from, hopefully, from the profit discussion, is that we want the person making the decision to bear the costs and get the benefits. If we have that, then we would expect to end up at the social optimum of the behavior. We would neither have too much of the behavior nor too little of the behavior. So let's stop for a moment and think about pollution. What is pollution? Or we could talk about really you could say that you coughing on me could be pollution. What is pollution? We tend to think that pollution is damage to the environment. But what is damage? And do we want to end all of it? Turns out pollution, right? Damage to the environment. Well, how do we figure out what is damaging to the environment? It turns out that it's better to think about pollution not as damage to the environment, but harm to other people without their consent. Slightly novel definition of pollution, but let's see if we can wrap our heads around why I would say that. So when I've alluded to the fact that I grew up at least part of the year on a cattle ranch out in southeastern Montana, and land out there was pretty poor. We had a lot of land for not a whole large number of cattle. Turns out, what did we do? Did we take our stuff to the county dump? No, we didn't. What we did was we stuck stuff in the back of the pickup, and my father picked a draw, and we would go to the top of the hill and we'd throw stuff down the hill. Now, this was all on our property. Was that pollution? Well, you might say that that was pollution, but it's like, I mean, that would be the equivalent of saying that in my own apartment, that my um, flatulence is pollution. But we wouldn't typically view that as pollution. We'd say, well, it's not air pollution because it's not affecting other people. And that's the same thing there. So us dumping trash down a gully wasn't pollution in any analytical sense, unless the stuff that we pushed down the hill eventually the wind took it and blew it over to the O'Connor's place. They were some of our neighbors, or the McGill's place. They were some of our other neighbors, or right? If it blew onto their land and affected them in a negative way, would that be pollution? Well, it depends. Did we contact them and say, look, if some of our stuff blows onto your land, we will come pick it up and we will compensate you for the inconvenience? If we did that blowing over, and they said that's fine, assuming they said yes, that would be fine, then that still wouldn't be pollution. It would, in order for it to be pollution, we would have had to harm others without their consent. That's what pollution is. And that's why we're concerned about this. So my flatulence in my apartment, we would expect that I would, again, eat beans to the point where I'm uncomfortable enough by my own fumes that I cut back on eating beans. We get the optimal amount of the behavior. However, if somebody else bears part of the cost and I'm able to impose this on them without their consent, we would expect too much bean consumption or too much flatulence. And that's why we're concerned about this. We're not concerned about it because of the distributional impacts that some people are better or worse off. That's a separate concern. What we're concerned as a first concern is that we have the right amount of the behavior. So hopefully you understand the concern. And so this would be the case, right? Do we want no disease transmission from COVID? Well, no, because what would it take to actually drive the disease transmission to zero? Basically, we'd have to shut down all of society for like what, 3 weeks, and we'd have to lock everybody in their home. That probably wouldn't be a good thing. Almost certainly wouldn't be a good thing. So the goal can't be to drive transmission to zero. We want some disease transmission, not because we value it, but because the cost of stamping out the last unit of disease transmission is greater than the benefit. But we would want the people who impose or who have an impact on other people, whose behavior has a spillover, to bear the cost of their actions. So let's think about, hopefully that's clear. And if it's not, you'll have to let me know. But here would be the next question. Why are costs imposed on people without their willing consent? I'll stop this video there and you can think about that. Actually, I'll keep going. I'm tired of chopping these up, and you can let me know if that is helpful or not. But you can think about, why are costs imposed upon people without their consent? And the answer ends up being because of the rules, because of what we call property rights. Now, I've alluded to these before, but this is really why we care about the rules. True externalities or true spillover or pollution are really, as I've already mentioned, a conflict over rights, or they're a violation of rights. And so in the current environment, if you get me sick, basically, I'm going to say, well, did I have a right not to be gotten sick by you? If I don't, then there's actually no spillover to me, but I actually provide a spillover to you by being around. It turns out that environmental problems are property rights problems. And a lot of the other areas in society where we struggle right now with disease transmission, really, it's a property rights problem. Do I have a right not to have other people enter a space within 2 meters around me? We're rewriting some of these social norms. everybody, a lot of people who I hear who, they go to the grocery store. I haven't been to the grocery store yet, but people who go to the grocery store say, look, guess what? I go to the grocery store and I'm reaching into the freezer compartment and somebody reaches in over the top of me and I'm irritated. And I say, look, I want to yell at them and say, get out of my space. Well, what's happening? We are in effect rewriting the rules and the expectations around your personal space, around the property rights there. Now, we should expect, unless we get some cultural norms enforced or even governmental reinforcement of that, that we would see people using your space. Let's say that you do have a right to that, but we don't currently have an enforcement mechanism. Then we would expect to see people invading your personal space. Why? Because they get the full benefit of doing so, and they only bear part of the cost of doing so. And so, to some extent, what we are currently trying to do, whether it's with Governor Bullock's shelter in place or people yelling at other people to stay at home, is in effect, we are trying to, at least this is the idea, this is the analytic argument behind this, from an economic point of view, we are rewriting the rules to try and get people to take into account the cost of their actions on other people. So again, we would expect factories to use labor and air and steel as inputs into their production process. That makes sense. But we would expect them to use too much of those things if they can use them without charge. There's nothing different than anything else we've talked about, whether it's pollution or disease or these other things. If I get all of the benefit and I can use your labor for free, in other words, we reduce the cost of my engaging in a production process, we would get too much production. Now, this may seem weird in the current environment where we're particularly concerned about the state of the economy, but it is entirely possible to have too much production from a societal point of view, that we would be better off if we cut back on production. I'm not saying that's what is currently happening, but basically, again, we as economists are not concerned about maximizing the amount of stuff. We are concerned about maximizing value. And one of the things to note is that individuals are almost certainly going to engage in too much of a behavior if the rules permit them to use other people's resources without compensating them. By the same token, we would expect too little of a behavior if the rules permit other people to get some of the benefit without having to compensate the person who took the action. So this hopefully kind of starts to help us understand why certain things might be pollution or suboptimal and other things aren't. So if you think about, as an example, noise from aircraft flying over your house, is that pollution? Well, the answer is it depends. It really depends on whether the people under the flight path voluntarily engage in that. In other words, were they there before the airport? If they were there before the airport and they had a reasonable expectation that there wouldn't be an airport, then that is pollution. Now, if the airport had to come and compensate them and that they had the veto over the airport, then it wouldn't be pollution. If they came to the nuisance after the fact, in other words, they bought a house under the flight path of the airport, they clearly came to that with their full willing consent, at which point that's not pollution. People, right? So there are benefits and costs to airports, but for most of the people who live up near the airport now, almost none of them were there. I don't think any of them were there before the airport. And so for none of the current residents is the airport pollution. Same thing would be the case. My guess is not all of you are like me living alone. I have spent the last, I guess it's almost 3 weeks now, in the company of my cat. I'm probably going a little bit more nuts than usual. But some of you have significant others or parents or kids in the house with you. Now, those other people may well get you sick. Is that pollution? No, Because again, you have voluntarily taken them into your personal space. You're sharing this space, at which point them getting you sick would not be a violation of the rules of the property rights. And so in that case, it wouldn't be pollution. There would be a spillover, but there wouldn't be an externality. Now, that's a fine point. I wouldn't worry too much about the difference between externalities and spillovers, except for, let me say, that externalities, in the jargon of economists, require a rights argument, that you have violated my right, as opposed to spillovers are more general, that your behavior has an impact on me. So why don't we define the rules and the rights so that people can't impose costs on other people without their willing consent? Why don't we do that? I mean, we could do that. We could force anybody who gets me sick to compensate me, at which point they would take into account the costs of them reaching over my shoulder into the freezer section at the grocery store. So why don't we do that? Why don't we do that with air pollution or noise pollution? Why don't we do that with, right, my neighbors? Historically, now this may just be the new way of living, but pretty much I live in a duplex. It's 2 units, and my neighbors have traditionally and continually smoked a lot of weed. I don't know what it is about this apartment building, or maybe it's just the type of people who rent apartments in buildings smoke a lot of marijuana. Now, the smell of my neighbor's marijuana has persistently come through the vents, but not the smoke, right? So what do I end up with? Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of the smell. And so basically, what are they doing? They're weighing the benefits of smoking up with the costs. And they are imposing some cost on me. So why don't we rewrite the rules to keep them from doing that? And it actually turns out there are some rules that, right, these are non-smoking apartments, etc. Or why don't we enforce and put in place rules that everybody has a right to 2 meters of personal space? Hopefully you have some understanding. Maybe something jumps out at you here. This term, transaction costs. Turns out that it takes time, energy, and resources both to define and then enforce the rules. And it would make sense not to define and enforce the rules when the costs of doing so are greater than the benefit. So we can't get rid of all externalities. We should expect there to be some spillovers. Well, we could get rid of spillovers, but the way we would have to do that would be to really and completely socially isolate ourselves. Go somewhere where we have, right, create our own little space station where other people's flatulence and other people's production decisions, both good and bad, all of these things have no impact on us. Now, hopefully that makes you say, well, wait, wouldn't that be a world where we aren't able to take advantage of specialization and gains from trade? And the answer is yes. So there is, right, because specialization and gains from trade are positive spillovers. The fact that I can find other people to trade with, actually, that's a positive spillover, that other people, right? Now that may not be an externality if we have the property rights correct. So, right, we would probably expect too many poorly dressed or, right, sloppily dressed people running around. Why? Because they're able to offload some of that cost or the harm to other people. They get all of the benefit of dressing comfortably. They don't bear all of the cost. On the other hand, we might expect to have too few beautiful people or well-groomed people around, or people who have really exercised well. Why? Because other people get part of the benefit, whereas that person bears all of the cost. And so we might expect an under provision of beautiful people, right? People who don't interrupt conversation and won't listen, or people who interrupt conversation and won't listen. Again, what happens? They get all the benefit of being heard, but they are able to offload some of the cost on other people. So, what are some solutions to spillovers? And here I will go ahead and stop this video, and hopefully you can maybe sit down and jot down some thoughts on a sheet of paper and figure out how we might address the issue. Now, hopefully you understand what the concern is from the point of view of an economist here. And I will stop this here and we can come back and maybe talk about some ways to address, not solve, but probably mitigate spillovers.